Having experienced a mentalist for the first time, phenomenal, much a learning curve for all of us that are aspiring to be leaders of growth.
So that you can obviously create the most influential leadership team and outlead your competitors.
The carrot analogy was awesome, or metaphor was awesome, where there's a lot of stuff underneath the surface.
So in this analogy, there is a root cause to our reactions and our behaviors.
Mindset shift is pivotal to any change that we want to make into our organization.
My own beliefs and how to challenge those beliefs in a way that just brings out the best in me.
So now you're focusing on the process of growing, not just the result.
I love the idea of high performance in a different way, that you're looking at the process rather than only the result.
Seasons change, and if your mindset doesn't change, you can't evolve and grow.
I want to share with you quickly 3 case studies that came out in my research.
I think it was an eye-opener because I could really identify with a lot of the case studies.
Opening yourself to new opportunities for learning, and I wish that more people can be exposed to this type of learners.
Leadership in an organization is the job of influencing the culture of that organization to be one of high performance. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Wow, it's so great to be in front of all of you again. There are so many of you who I haven't seen in so long, pre-COVID or before BC, as Glenn mentioned. And Glenn, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And there's many of you who I have seen recently, lots of familiar faces and old friends, people who have presented at your conferences, or we're doing leadership programs together. But I'm always curious, especially for the people who are brand new and have no idea what I do or what to expect. Who actually is like really familiar with what a mentalist does? Just put up just a show of hands. It's always just a nice poll that I like to run from time to time. Who is familiar? All right, there's some hands that are going up. Good. Put up your hand, okay, if you have no idea what a mentalist does. Surely there'll be some more hands there. Okay, good. Put down your hands. And I have to ask this just based on the hands. Put up your hands if you're not going to put up your hands no matter what I ask. There's always one or two of you. Thank you. Why is my mother putting up her hand? That's not... Thank you very much. Sometimes the best way to explain something is to demonstrate it. So let's try a little experiment. I'm going to find somebody in the audience. I'm going to try to find them randomly, very high tech, by using this ball of paper. If you are a lady or a gent and it lands in your lap, you are the selected one. If it comes close to you and you catch it, you're also the selected one. Which side am I going to attempt for this experiment? Let's go over here on this side. I'm just going to give it kind of a random throw behind me. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. And it's like blowing the bouquet at a wedding, right? Who's the lucky person? Right, where did it land? Right over there. Fantastic. Would you stand up for us, please? And you can stay by your seat there and just tell everybody what your name is. Angelique. All right. Do people call you Angie? What do you prefer? Angie. My wife's name is Angie. So you know my wife. Do you follow her online? You do follow her online? So she'll be happy to hear that. Angie, I've spelled it the way that you spell it, right? I-E at the end. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible this time in the morning. Angie, I want you to make your mind blank and then listen to me counting. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now I want you to think of a 2-digit number. Have you got one in mind? While you're thinking of it, I want you to count out loud from 0 to 9. Go ahead.
0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Okay, Angie. Angie will... Okay, Angie, I've written a message down here, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. I've kind of committed myself, but I want you to commit to yourself, to everybody who's over here. I asked you to think of a 2-digit number. Now, right now, I want you to go ahead and tell everybody, what is the 2-digit number that you're thinking of? Say it out loud.
13.
13. And that was your own free choice. Like, nobody came up to you, nobody said to you, Angie, you're gonna catch a ball, and then you have to answer a question or anything like that. Isn't it crazy that I wrote down here, Angie will say 13. Check it out, and give Angie a big round of applause. Angie, just to obviously for everybody to know, like, we haven't prearranged anything. You have no idea what we were about to do over here with this experiment, right? No, you can keep the ball of paper and you can sit down. Did I influence you? Did I read you? I don't know. Is it all? Who knows? Okay, but you can sit down. Thank you so much. There really is a science behind influence, and I want to share with you some of that here today. We know that today we're here to learn all about influence, and there's kind of different angles that I'm going to be approaching it. But one of the big takeaways from today is for me to share with you the most prevalent, invisible barrier that prevents leaders, especially senior leaders, from being able to be the most influential, to have the highest impact and influence with their teams, with the organization. And so the goal, the reason why we want to do this is so that you can obviously create the most influential leadership team and outlead your competitors. I believe that at the heart of a winning organization are winning teams, and we want to apply it not just to our own personal influence, but how do we create the most influential team. So that is what we can expect here today. Leadership ultimately is influence. John Maxwell, leadership guru, always says that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. There's an African proverb that says that if you think you're leading people but you don't have anybody following you, if you haven't influenced people to follow you, if you look behind you, there's no one following you, you're not leading anyone, you're just taking a hike. We need to be able to influence people to follow us, right? And so what is the role of influence and leadership in an organization? Well, simply put, leadership in an organization is the job of influencing the culture of that organization to be one of high performance. Management is about maintaining systems and processes, maintaining direction, right? But leadership is being able to move people in new directions, and for that we need influence. And what is the purpose? That is a means to an end, to create a high performance, winning culture in the organization. That is ultimately what I want to help you to be able to do here today. And so it's no mistake why in 2020, $356 billion was spent on leadership development. This is a statistic that I got from an HBR article. And the same article pointed to research that showed that 75% of leaders, senior leaders who were surveyed, they surveyed about 329 big organizations, 75% said that they didn't believe that their leadership development programs were all that effective. Now, why would that be? Now, some people might say, well, it's because we need to teach different things in the leadership development programs. And maybe that could be true. I mean, you get programs and you get programs. But as a mentalist, I'm fascinated with what happens in the mind. And I thought to myself, well, is there something, perhaps with leaders, something that's happening below the surface that's preventing them from bringing everything that they've learned into the right moment, to the right situation at the right time? And perhaps that's part of the reason. So I wondered to myself, what is the missing piece of the puzzle? And so I started to investigate, and I came up with this analogy of a carrot. I think one of the best ways for me to describe this is perhaps just to draw it out over here. But as you can see, with a carrot, there is some of it that is above the surface, and there is some of it that is below the surface. Let's imagine that above the surface is what you can actually see. And so imagine what we can see in ourselves and in each other. That would be our behaviors, we can see our actions, and also our reactions. So let me go ahead and write this over here. So we can see our reactions and behaviors. That is above the surface. But just as a carrot has got leaves above the surface, the thing supporting these leaves, that actually gives life to these leaves, is what is below the surface. And what we call carrot is actually a root. So in this analogy, there is a root cause to our reactions and our behaviors. And that root cause begins with our beliefs. What is a belief? A belief is an idea that we feel such certainty about that it becomes our truth. It's what we know. And when we have a certain belief, sometimes we don't even realize that we have the belief. It's totally invisible because we don't even know that there's alternative beliefs out there. It's just something that's being conditioned into us. When we have a belief about something, that will then turn into having certain assumptions. When we have certain assumptions, those assumptions can be about ourselves. The assumptions could be about other people, and it could be about the way that the world works, the world in general. Now, when we're put in certain contexts, so let's imagine that this line over here is a context. Those beliefs that have generated certain assumptions will then evoke certain emotions. So let's put an example to this. Let's say that you believe, you may not even realize it might just be a gut feeling that you have. Even if logically you know you should think something different. You may have a belief that there's a limited amount of opportunity, let's say, in your industry. And that will lead to an assumption that if you see somebody else getting a really big promotion, that it means that there's less opportunity for you to get. And so there's a sense of scarcity which brings in a whole bunch of emotions. And those emotions will then impact whatever your reactions and behaviors are. Now, I'm using words like scarcity, and you're probably already thinking to yourself things like scarcity mindset and abundance mindset. That is what I'm talking about, right? Now, those aren't the mindsets that I'm here to talk about today, but this is a good definition of mindset. Our mindset is the combination of beliefs and assumptions that we have about ourselves. When we have it about ourselves, that becomes part of our identity. That I believe that I am a certain type of person. And so we make certain assumptions about that. But we have beliefs and assumptions. We have a mindset about other things as well. And the mindset is ultimately like a lens. It is a lens that influences how we interpret what's happening behind us. This is why you can take two leaders who were in the exact same leadership development program. You can put those leaders in exactly the same scenario. But because their lens is different, because their beliefs and assumptions, their mindset is different, they're going to have very different perceptions of what is actually happening. They'll have very different emotional reactions, and therefore they'll have very different behaviors. If you think that our decisions that we make, and listen, our lives are a reflection of all the decisions that we make, if we think that we do things logically, we really do things emotionally and then back it up with logic. Antonio Damasio, a well-known neuroscientist, he had a case with a patient whose name was Elliot, to protect his identity. He had damage to the part of his brain, the orbifrontal precortex, that controls things like emotion and logic and that kind of stuff. And when he had damage to that part of his brain, when he recovered, he had all of his intellect. But he could not feel anything, he had no emotion. And he couldn't even make the simplest of decisions. He couldn't choose whether to use the red pen or the black pen. If he wanted to go for lunch somewhere, he would go and check the menu. He would check what the parking was like, what was the temperature like inside. He couldn't make a decision. His whole marriage fell to pieces. He lost his job. His whole life fell apart. Subsequently, there have been at least 50 cases that have shown similar things. So it's our emotions that control our emotions, our reactions and behaviors, and even before that is our beliefs and assumptions. So I want to share with you a story of how this applied to me in my own life. I'm going to have to put my ego aside for this because Glenn mentioned that I presented for NATO. There's a part of that story that I'm going to share with you now that most people don't know. And I guess maybe I should set the scene a little bit for the story so that maybe you feel the emotions that I felt on the day. So you can tell that my mouth gets dry very easily. On the day, I was so nervous, like so nervous. I mean, I was presenting to leaders from over 40 countries, politicians, leaders in the military were there, academia, private sector. I was the opening keynote speaker of the 3-day Strategic Communications Conference in Latvia. Afterwards, I was on a panel discussion. I was one of 3 panelists. The other panelist was Dr. Michael Platt, who's a professor at the Wharton School in UPenn, and Professor Jan Engelman, who is the associate professor of neuroeconomics at University of Amsterdam. And then there was me. So I had enormous imposter syndrome. Who here relates to imposter syndrome? I can see lots of heads nodding. I don't think enough people talk about imposter syndrome, by the way. That kind of quiet suspicion that I don't really belong here, I don't know what I'm doing, I might open my mouth and then everybody will know that I don't know what I'm doing here. And this is what I thought. I was backstage, and so I was talking about the dry mouth because when I walked out, my mouth was so dry. That my teeth were so dry. That when I walked out and smiled and said good morning to everybody, my top lip got stuck to the top of my teeth. And I was like, this is how it felt, right? And I had to get a sip of water just to get my mouth, just to climatize, right? And so already the voice in my head was going, you see, Gilan, this is proof. you shouldn't be so nervous. You should be perfect. You should be totally at ease here if you belong here. This was what the critical voice in my head was telling me. And then I did the keynote, which seemed to go smoothly. But afterwards, I was on the panel discussion. And that seemed to be going okay until one of the people in the audience, who was a well-known British journalist, stood up and he said to me, Gilan, he's looking at his phone. He says, Gilan, can you tell us, what is the source of your statistics that you gave in your talk about car accidents? Because I'm Googling here, and the figures that I'm getting are very different. Being streamed internationally, right? Have you ever had somebody say to you, tell me a joke? Now, tell me a joke. And you go blank. I just could not think of my source. And the more pressure I felt, because already I had all of this emotion inside of me. Already I had this turmoil inside. I just couldn't think of it. I had to sheepishly say, look, I know it's from a reliable source, but I just cannot think of it right now. And I was dying inside. I was dying so much so that I was sitting there and I berated myself. I got lost in this river of thoughts and emotion thinking, what was my source? What was that damn source? And totally unmindful of what was going on until finally I woke up. I was snapped out of it when the facilitator of the panel discussion said, okay, well, we'll actually end off this panel discussion by asking that question to all 3 panelists. And I thought to myself, what was the question? Because I was so lost in thought. By the way, this was one of my prominent lessons of why mindfulness as a skill is so important, to be able to let things go and be present in the moment. Otherwise, we miss important things. And I did in that moment. And I thought to myself, well, thank goodness they're starting on the other side. Maybe I'll pick it up from the other gentleman's answers. And I couldn't. It was very ambiguous from their answers. And eventually it got to me. And I actually had to say, I'm so sorry. I was still thinking about my source. Can I just confirm, was this the question? And I gave an answer. And I don't think it was an amazing answer. I was just it wasn't a bad answer, but I was still berating myself that I wasn't able to bring my best self into that particular moment. Now, even though afterwards, when the press release came out, they said that I was a highlight of the conference, that didn't really change, actually. That kind of reinforcement felt superficial for me. In fact, it took me 8 months to eventually be able to even bring myself to watch that footage. And there was so much that I could learn from that. It took me 8 months just to even revisit the experience in my mind. And so I was actively, but subconsciously, preventing myself from engaging in something that could actually help me to grow. And so when I thought about this and this whole conundrum in terms of leadership and what is the biggest barrier that's preventing leaders from bringing our best influence, I thought to myself, well, I was preventing myself from A, bringing my best influence into the moment, and B, from even learning from the experience, and that was because of all those emotions that I felt. Now, at the time when it all happened, I didn't think consciously that I'm avoiding it. I didn't have time to go through it. I had other big projects. So I was actually fooling myself. I was deceiving, self-deception. So it was a total blind spot. But upon reflection, when I was dealing with this matter, I realized that there were these emotions that were sabotaging. And so I thought to myself, okay, if that's the emotions, what is the belief system that's creating the assumptions? And is that what all other leaders or most other leaders are experiencing. And so I started to dive into this a little bit more. I was reading scientific journals, I was reading books, I was taking courses and watching videos and any article I could find. I was speaking to leaders. And I discovered that there is a pair of beliefs. They're actually opposites to each other. And we all have a certain amount of a kind of strength of belief in one and the other. That totally sabotages our ability to lead. And unfortunately, these beliefs, well, the one is good to be conditioned into us as children, but the other one really doesn't serve us. And it's one of the most common ones to be conditioned into us from childhood. Let me explain to you how. Who over here, put up your hands, be honest. I'll put up my hands already at the beginning. Who over here has said to any child who has done something quickly, done it well, "Oh, wow, you did that so quickly, you're so clever. Look how smart you are." Put up your hands if you've done that. "Oh, yeah, you've given a child positive," because we care about those children, right? Of course. Everybody's hand should be up. How many times have you seen a child do something, you're like, "Wow, look how brilliant you did that. On your first time, you're so talented." We've all said that, right? And it's to really build the child's confidence. But what the child hears, not logically, just the perception that starts to build, is that if I can't do something like that quickly, it means I'm not smart. If I can't do something like that brilliantly for the first time, it means that I don't have talent. If I don't do this, if I can't solve this puzzle perfectly with ease, really quickly, it means that I didn't have intelligence. "Oh, Billy over there took longer to solve that thing. I was born with more smarts than Billy." And so there's this belief that starts to form, this idea that starts to get a sense of certainty that we are born with a certain amount of intelligence. But then later on in primary school, we go for IQ tests. And I don't know about you guys, but they wouldn't even tell me what the number was. I don't think they told any children. But that was to measure what your intellect was, what you were endowed with. But you can see how that seed of an idea that grows and gets reinforced and gets reinforced and gets reinforced. And we never ever realize that belief is even there, but it's our one undeniable truth, that we're just born with a certain amount of intellect, talent, or with a certain type of character, the kind of person who we are, and that doesn't change and can't change very much from birth. So in the literature, Stanford professor Carol Dweck terms this having a fixed mindset, which simply put is the belief that our intelligence, talent, and character are fixed traits that cannot change very much. If you believe that categorically, you would have what we call a strong fixed mindset. But there's a spectrum over here, right? So maybe you believe that it can change a little bit. Or maybe you believe that it can change a lot, but the people who are right at the top, who are the most successful in the world, they are there because they didn't have to work as hard, or because they had some special talent or mental ability that just got them there, that they were born with. And so with a fixed mindset, there are certain assumptions, if we think back to the carrot analogy. The one assumption, like I mentioned, is that the most successful people in the world are there because of some special level of brilliance. The other assumption is that achieving success with ease and with little effort, so we build a relationship with effort. So if something takes more effort for us to put into it, then we start to feel like, oh, well, maybe this means that I'm not so as smart as I thought, because I should be able to do this really easily, right? And so we know that there's a certain perception that starts to form. The perception that starts to form is the tendency to perceive every situation as something that's either going to validate the special level of brilliance that I was born with. So we are out there, we've had positive validation from people. We even, just for ourselves, we want to believe that we have a certain above average intellect. So we built this identity, because those are the beliefs and assumptions we have about ourselves. And now everything that happens, I'm either going to look smart, even just to myself. There may not even be anyone around. And if I look smart and feel smart, it validates my identity. Or I could have an identity crisis when there's something that makes me feel that maybe I'm not as smart as I've come to believe that I am. And so situations are either there to validate or threaten our identity. So we have this tendency to want to look and feel smart. And this is me in grade 2 I think I was 8 years old at the time. And I was just going into primary school. And primary school was an amazing time of my life. I got tons of validation. I was told how talented I was. My teachers told my parents that I had some unique mix of the stereotypical left-right brain. I was getting academic awards and a provincial chess player, but I was also lead in the school play, I was creative and logical, and I built up this expectation. I was in special academic programs that gave enriching material for people who apparently were smarter than, all of this kind of stuff, right? This identity that I built was so strong that I had some kind of special brilliance that I was born with. I wasn't arrogant, it was just a belief that I had. That when I went to high school, I tanked. I nearly failed high school. I'm not proud of it. Literally, I don't think I got an A in any subject. I nearly failed many subjects. Now, why did that happen? When I got to high school, the workload increased, and the complexity of the problems that I needed to solve increased as well. And that required me to have to put more effort into trying to figure things out. So much so that it totally unconsciously started to threaten this identity that I had. So I started to have a bit of an identity crisis. Am I really this brilliant kid that everybody, and that I thought that I was? And so I just lost interest in school. Now, I use the word tanked, borrowing it from sports. I was watching a Netflix documentary called The Coach's Playbook, and they were interviewing Patrick Mouratoglou. He's a well-known tennis player. He's coached people like Serena Williams. And he told a story of how he was watching a student of his. She was a very talented tennis player. She knew she was talented. That was her identity. She was playing in a tournament against somebody else who she knew she was more talented than. But this opponent was giving her a really strong run for her money. And then all of a sudden, she just seemed to give up on the game. It was like she just lost interest in it. She just stopped going for the balls that she should have been going for. It just seemed to lack a little bit of energy. Her head wasn't in the game. And she had every excuse. Well, she didn't eat well. It was too hot. Someone in the audience distracted her from that particular point. And fast forward that interview, what he had come to discover was that it was more psychologically comfortable for this young lady to not give her best and to fail. Still hanging on to the identity that had I given my best, I definitely would have won because I've still got that talent. And so if she had laid it all out on the tennis court and given her absolute all and still lost, she would have had an identity crisis inside. And in a similar way, I basically lost interest and tanked high school. I blamed the curriculum. I would say that this teacher didn't care about me and didn't give me any attention. So the whole schooling system is flawed. That I had how is this going to help me after school? I had all of those excuses. And at the time, I was totally unconscious about the fact that the real thing behind this was that I had this belief that created certain assumptions, and that those emotions under the surface that I was unconscious of was driving that behavior. So this is the power that a fixed mindset has. Now, the opposite is a growth mindset. A growth mindset is the belief that our intelligence, our character, and our talents are not fixed traits. That through effort and method, we can literally grow those things. We can literally become more intelligent, more talented. We can change literally the type of person who we are if we have the right method and through the right effort. And when we've got a growth mindset, we have certain assumptions that come with that as well. This is Alfred Binet. Does anyone know who he is? He's the inventor of the IQ test. What was the IQ test actually invented for? It was invented to test our IQ, right? This is what we grew up. Our intelligence, to tell us whether we were on the high intelligence scale or not. But actually, it wasn't invented for that purpose at all. Alfred Binet, a Frenchman in the early 1920s, invented the IQ test to be able to ascertain which students in the public schooling system in France were benefiting from the curriculum, and which weren't, so that they could change parts of the curriculum in a way that would better serve and help those children to grow their intelligence. And so he created this test that later on became what we know of the IQ test. Now, he even wrote in one of his seminal pieces, this is just an excerpt, all right? The original is a little bit longer. He said, a few modern philosophers assert that an individual's intelligence is a fixed quantity, a quantity which cannot be increased. And this is the line that I just love most out of all of it. He says, we must protest and react about such brutal pessimism. And he goes on to say that with practice, training, and above all method, we're able to increase our attention, our memory. So this is not just limited to intellect. Our judgment, and literally to become more intelligent than we were before. This is the inventor of the IQ test. And somewhere along the line, things got a little bit confused, right? Did you know that this doesn't just apply to intellect? What about creativity? What about sporting ability, physical ability? Did you know that Charles Darwin was actually considered to be an extremely ordinary child? One of the intellects of our time. Ben Hogan, one of the greatest golfers of all time, was considered to be totally uncoordinated and graceless as a child. Through effort and method, he reached the top. Cindy Sherman, who's been on practically every list of the most important artists of the 20th century, she failed her first photography course. But she worked on her creativity, worked on her skill, and reached the highest levels. So it's not about saying, oh, well, you know, if I work on things, I can get pretty good. It's about saying that you can literally be one of the best in the world. And our level of belief in that is going to determine what our mix between fixed and growth mindset is, where we are on that spectrum. Now, over here, you'll see that it's even backed by science. If you know my work, you know that I kind of have this scientific approach. I love science, and I'm fascinated that we can actually look under a microscope and see brain cells connecting. That's what you just saw in the middle over there. Neurons, which are brain cells for all practical purposes, when we learn things, they create synaptic connections. And those connections get stronger and stronger, and then they become neural pathways. And those neural pathways become stronger and stronger the more we do things. And so that's how we actually develop our brains. And that's how we can literally become more intelligent and develop creativity and skills. And the list goes on and on. You can see 2 weeks before training on the left, and you can see the density of neural pathways in this scan 2 months after training. So what are the assumptions with the growth mindset? Well, one could be that the most successful people in the world reach that level because of their appetite for growing through failure. So failure is not seen as something that threatens my identity. It's seen as a necessity that I have to go through because that's going to help me to grow. There has to be something. I have to be trying something new, and I may not be good at it right at the start. And they take responsibility for their growth. So the question I'm often asked is, well, what should we say to children? Well, here are 3 things that you could say to children instead of, oh, you're so clever. The one is praising them for the effort that they put into solving something or doing something. If something is so easy for them that they didn't have to put in any effort, apologize to them. I say that tongue-in-cheek, but you could say, oh, wow, you did that so quickly, but I'm so sorry I didn't give you something that would challenge you. Why don't we try to find something a little bit more challenging that can actually help you to learn? So now you're focusing on the process of growing, not just the result. Whereas the alternative just focuses on, did I get a good result? The other thing that you could do is to praise the child for taking different strategies, different approaches. By the way, I'm talking about a child, but this is for anyone, right? Different strategies and approaches. And thirdly, what about being resourceful and actually asking for help? Not giving it away and saying, I give up, but learning how to do it. Now, effort, different strategies, and being resourceful, asking for help, all 3 of those have a common thread, which is that it's all about taking responsibility. In every one of those scenarios, we're learning to have a relationship with taking responsibility for our own growth. And so that is an assumption that people with a growth mindset have. If I am to grow, I need to do it. Effort and failure are not a threat to one's identity. We went through that. So I thought to myself, well, this makes a ton of sense. I can see evidence in my own stories back from school, and there's others as well, NATO. The literature supports it, but are leaders experiencing this here? And so many of you here in this room have already engaged with me in this change, what I call a change mindset assessment. I approached a handful of clients, and I said, let's run this assessment with your executive team. It's called change mindset. One of the components is to measure mindset. That's all I said. And what I was really measuring was fixed and growth mindset, which is really what are people's beliefs? How strongly planted are they in fixed or growth? And what I found after running this with several teams, there were numerous people in each team, 91% of C-level and senior leaders were on the fixed mindset spectrum, identifying with fixed mindset beliefs. And remember, I mentioned the spectrum earlier, that we've got a strong growth mindset or a strong fixed mindset, but a lot of people have got somewhere in between, a fixed mindset with some growth ideas, or a growth mindset with some fixed ideas. And we went through what that looks like already. And so most people are somewhere actually in the middle, but those fixed ideas can totally sabotage our ability to influence, other than to create influential teams. I want to share with you quickly 3 case studies that came out in my research and my interactions and discussions and the coaching sessions that I did with leaders who took this assessment. Case number 1, I want you to see which of these 3 cases, maybe even all 3 of them, that you relate to most. So, struggling with a problem that starts to feel very complex, and successful results are more difficult to attain than expected. That is the scenario that the leader finds themselves in. Let's have a look at what the belief system is. All right, we know, and I'm only dealing with fixed mindsets for these. So the belief system will always be that intelligence and character are fixed traits. The assumption in this particular situation is that low results indicate hitting limits of intelligence and ability, and that if I was smart, or if the people I was working with were smart, this should be easier. And the emotions that it will give, and this is not an exhaustive list, is fear, vulnerability. Now, the fear and vulnerability is that I might discover that I'm not as brilliant as I thought, and so there's an avoidance of shame. I've got shame up there, but it's really, there's like an unconscious flinch that we want to avoid a situation that could bring that sense of shame, and maybe even frustration and anger with ourselves and with others. What are the actions and behaviors on a personal level? Firstly, an overfocus on results, because those results are either going to prove to ourselves and to others that our identity is right or wrong. So we become obsessed with just getting the results, sometimes at all costs, and sometimes those costs are actually much higher than what we think. We lose interest, that's tanking. So you could literally tank an entire project or an entire strategy that suddenly starts to feel more complex and difficult, and be totally unconscious that we're actually doing that. With that comes blaming external circumstances. So there will always be a justification to motivate why we're tanking. Becoming a non-learner is another one. By the way, becoming a non-learner, for example, is like when I didn't go back to actually learn from my experience with NATO and other contexts, so we become a non-learner in that context. Now, as a leader, there's certain consequences as well. Again, hyper-focusing, even rewarding only results. Many organizations still only reward results, but what about the process? What about all the people who have grown? What about all the people who took responsibility, who focus on that process? They should be rewarded as well, right? But there's this hyper-focus on results in teams. Low expectations, so the Pygmalion effect. People will rise to the level of expectation you have of them. So with her permission, my mother-in-law, who I was speaking to the other day about this, she said, well, you know what? She related to this point. She said, I struggled a little bit with maths in school. And my mother said to me, well, you should drop maths, because I couldn't do maths, so I don't think that you'll be able to do it either. Now, when you're a leader of a team, and you think that you're the brilliant one, that you're the leader because you're the one with the intellect and talent and experience and everything, and you're struggling with something, what does that do to your expectation of what the people in your team can do? And as you lower your expectation of what they're capable of, you're never going to give them the opportunity to rise to a higher level of expectation. And so that's what I mean by low expectations. A result of that, we prematurely demobilize some people. Sometimes we even just step in and do it ourselves. Or we just start telling them exactly what to do, and so we start to micromanage people. All of this will impact our influence, ultimately bottlenecking your team's growth. And bottlenecking, when you have an organization that's got this happening, a totally bottlenecks leadership, if you want to scale leadership, you need the opposite of this, right? So let's look at case number 2. Constant change is bringing a persistent sense of uncertainty. There's a drive for the leader and their team to take on new types of challenges amid many unknowns. Does anyone relate to that? Setbacks are experienced along the way. That's inevitable, right? Let's have a quick look at what is happening under the surface. We've got the fixed mindset. The assumptions that it gives is that we think, well, an innately brilliant person would know what to do, and they wouldn't look weak. We just have this vision in our mind that these talented, brilliant intellects, that they always kind of look like they know what to do. And so what ends up happening, the emotions that we feel when we feel that we don't know what to do, is we can start to feel that imposter syndrome. We have that uncertainty. We even start getting impatient with ourselves and with others. And so let's have a look at the reactions and behaviors. Firstly, on a personal level, there's a sense of overconfidence. Like in school, when I was tanking high school, I was like overconfident that I didn't need this stuff. So sometimes we fall for that bias as well. So we get an overconfidence. We're trying to compensate for the fact that we have this uncertainty. We become inflexible instead of being agile. We blame circumstance, like, well, things are just changing. Right? We're not taking responsibility. We divert accountability, and we avoid seeking feedback. Because why would we actively seek feedback if we're scared that maybe there'll be something that will prove that I don't really know what I'm doing? So we get these low feedback environments happening in teams, and nobody is growing. Because everybody's totally focused on just results, results, results. As a leader, start to act in ways that avoid looking weak or vulnerable, therefore starting to lack authenticity. Do you know leaders that you're just not sure if you even know them, they've never been vulnerable with you, on a true sense, not like forced vulnerability, but real authenticity. You get worse decision making. Part of that is because there's also an avoidance of feedback. Quicker to blame other people. A result of all of this is that you also get threatened by others. So like when I was in school, for example, and somebody else did really well on a test that I flunked, I wasn't inspired by that. It just made me feel worse about myself. And so we actually land up being threatened by other people's success. Now, what happens if you start getting threatened by someone's success who's in your team? What does that do in terms of creating a team dysfunction? And then damaging trust levels, which is huge, and we'll circle back to that later, and like I mentioned, the low feedback environment. Right, let's get to case number 3, which is the final one. The leader and their team have reached the top in their field. This is a totally different circumstance, right, compared to the first 2 cases. You're already number 1. Maybe you as a leader, maybe this applies to someone else in your organization, maybe your company is already number 1. Let's see how a fixed mindset or how fixed mindset ideas can totally sabotage that. So we've still got the fixed mindset as the belief system. The assumptions over here is I'm successful because of my innate brilliance. Whatever that may be in your particular context. Maybe it's creativity, maybe it's sport, maybe it's intelligence. Therefore, and we get the sense that I can turn on this brilliance at will. Like I worked hard to get here, and now that I'm here, it's because of who I am, innately. And this is where problems start to happen. Because the emotions that start to come up are ones of pride, even a subtle sense of superiority, and overconfidence, like we had mentioned before. And the reactions and behaviors that this starts to bring about is, on a personal level, taking success for granted, a subtle sense of complacency starts to creep in. Under preparation. It's like, well, I've done this so many times, or we do something new and you think, oh, I've got this. And so in under preparation, you're not preparing as much as you used to get to the top. In fact, John Wooden, who's a famous coach, he said that talent may get you to the top, but it's character that keeps you at the top. And that's what this is talking to. Because when you're at the top, do you think that it's just because of an innate character, or are you actively growing and working on your character to be the kind of person who stays at the top? And most people don't realize that there's a differentiation between that. And so there's becoming a non-learner, totally losing momentum and avoiding any criticism. So you don't even notice the warning signs along the way. As a leader, a culture of what I term royal hierarchy starts to form. So I'm at the top, And in fact, maybe we even think that our senior leaders are all brilliant in their own right. So there's a sense of elitism that starts to form. There's a hierarchy where you start having like the brilliant leaders and then all their helpers who carry out the plans. And that growth is not happening throughout the entire organization. Building a team of validators. So you may find that all of a sudden there's a lot of echo chambers or yes men or yes women. People who think that your ideas are always brilliant. And just go on to further validate this identity that we have. I already mentioned that we have the genius bottleneck, where there's kind of the genius, what I call a hero leader, and then all of their minions. Losing touch on the ground with people, with that is a low feedback environment. And ultimately, the entire team and the organization stops growing and gets left behind, and all of a sudden are no longer number one anymore. So we can see how it applies even when we're right at the top. So let's contrast this with the growth mindset. I'm not going to go through each one of the cases, but you'll get the idea. The belief system is totally different. That intelligence, character, and talent are not fixed traits. They can literally be grown. The assumption is, through effort and method, we can all expand our abilities to the highest levels of success. The emotions that we will feel is curiosity. We'll feel motivated. Even if we have fear that something seems like a daunting task, we'll have more courage. We'll be far more patient because with ourselves and with other people, because if somebody fails, we don't just see that as proof that they're just not good enough. We're more patient because we can see the growth potential that they can have. And so the reactions and behaviors as individuals, we're no longer chasing validation. We embrace change because we like the challenge. We seek out criticism. We actively create high feedback environments because we see that as an opportunity to grow and not something that's going to impact our identity and be a threat. We opt for the challenging goals. We value results and process. We're less reactive. And we have more robust confidence. You see, people, like I had some leaders when I did this assessment, they're like, oh, but especially when I was working with the CEO and we were assessing their team and we're looking at the mindset of the team, and I've had leaders say to me, oh, but that person is so confident. How could they have these, how come they're saying that they believe in these things that are leading to a fixed mindset? And the thing is that if you've got a growth and a fixed mindset, you can have high confidence. But the person with a fixed mindset's confidence is far more fragile. Because the moment there's a setback or something that could threaten that picture that they have of themselves, that self-identity, that shatters, and then all those emotions and reactions and behaviors that we discussed start coming up, which they're often very not even conscious of. As a leader with a growth mindset, we're able to create psychological safety in teams. Feedback-rich culture, high-performance coach. I believe that leaders should be there to help their people to grow. And coaching is a modality that is unbelievably powerful and relevant for that context. High expectation and trust. So just using that Pygmalion effect to a good degree. Being more responsive as opposed to reactive. Because when something's a threat to us, fight or flight, we become reactive. But when we don't have that threat, we're responsive. We reward results and process, and we're able to scale leadership in an organization. So to create a significantly influential leadership team and consistently outlead your competitors, you can see how a growth mindset is mandatory. And it's also the key for leaders to prioritize their own, to prioritize the team's wins over their own personal success and recognition. Because when I'm constantly looking for validation, a lot of what I'm driven to do is driven for me, for my own personal recognition. So I want to share with you a model that I put together that some of you will be familiar with, my significant influence model. It's in the printed white paper that you guys got, although the white paper deals with it in a slightly different context. But first, I want to quickly build a circular model which is inspired by Patrick Lencioni's 5 teams dysfunction pyramid. And I'll show you how this all fits into creating teams that are unbelievably influential. So let's start when there's an absence of trust in a team. Now, there's lots of things that go into creating an absence of trust. When people aren't able to be vulnerable with each other, when there's that lack of connection and authenticity, we already covered. You could see how our mindset can influence that. But also, there's an absence of trust when people don't feel that they're on the same agenda, that they've got different goals, a different sense of purpose. Maybe somebody's even got a personal agenda. And that's the foundation. We all got to be on the same page, right, to build that trust. When there's no trust in a team, then everybody fears conflict. So really what you want in an executive team is for people to engage in unfiltered, passionate debate around key issues. Not only do you get more robust thinking and decision-making out on the table, but if people are quietly withholding what they're really thinking, then there's all kind of water cooler chat, there's all the back channel sniping, and all of that starts to go on. And so when decisions are made, and they may not even be the best decisions for the reason I just mentioned, but when decisions are made, one of the consequences of this fear of conflict is that there's no real commitment to the decisions. Because people didn't think that they actually were part of making that decision. And so you don't get a very crystal clear commitment from anybody. And that starts to send confusion into those various teams as well. But when there is fear of conflict which leads to no commitment, that leads to an avoidance of accountability. Because even the most high-performing people in a team will struggle to hold somebody else accountable for something that they didn't even agree and commit to doing in the first place. When there's an avoidance of accountability, this is where there becomes an inattention to results. And we're talking about the team's results, the team's win. Rather, what starts to happen is people start focusing on their own individual ambitions, their own individual results, and their own personal recognition. And that then loops right back down and further exacerbates the absence of trust, because people are no longer all trying to win together as a team. And so we start finding that politics starts to come in, and silos and all kinds of interesting things can also start to develop. So, how do we begin? How do we take what I've mentioned here around mindset and how do we plug it in here so that we can avoid this? A fixed mindset exacerbates all of these team dysfunctions, and a growth mindset, of course, can help to turn it from the negative into the positive, where we have trust and safety, conscious conflict, true commitment, leading to accountability between the team and attention to result and prioritizing the team's win over anything else. So very quickly, now I have to say, this is very high level. I'm not going in depth. We're about to wrap up here. But I just for completeness want to share with you how this applies on a team level. So I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards, but I think this will make sense from a high level point of view. My significant influence model is three areas of influence that we need to develop. Influence isn't just about knowing the right things to do or say, what the right actions and behaviors are in a certain situation. There's other areas of influence, and these two over here, influence with a cause bigger than oneself, that would be a purpose. Now, there's always three types of purpose. There's the company's purpose, why it exists. The team has a certain purpose, which could be the immediate goal that they're working on. And then we've got our own personal purpose, and in an ideal world, we'd want to line all three of those up. But on an executive team, the purpose would be whatever the most immediate, highest priority goal is. Then, of course, we need self-influence, which I've deconstructed into mindfulness and mindset. And at the intersection of those two, we have conscious congruence with that strategic purpose. And when everybody not only knows what that purpose or goal is, and when everybody's got the right mindfulness and mindset and buys into it, and they're consciously congruent with that, then we know that we have a shared goal and purpose, and we create that trust and safety. Then when we throw in influence with others, we can see how at the intersection of influence with others and self-influence, we get responsive leadership as opposed to reactive, and that leads to conscious conflict and true commitment. And at the intersection of influence with others and influence with a cause, we get purpose-led leadership. And purpose-led could, again, be the purpose of the organization, or just the fact that we're holding each other accountable to the specific goal, the immediate goal that we have. That leads to accountability and therefore attention to results. So you can see how focusing on the significant influence model here by developing all three areas creates significant influence, but the outcome of that is a high-performance culture in an organization. So when developing a leadership development program, the place to actually start would be, and the key that's often missing are the things that we've mentioned here, things like growth mindset and, of course, getting that conscious congruence with purpose. So as we wrap up this part of the event and we move on to an interactive experiment, there are two big ideas, essentially, that I have shared with you here in the short amount of time that we've had together. The first idea, if my clicker cares to share it with us, is influential mindsets. That leaders must be equipped to observe what lies beneath the surface so that they can understand the root, the cause of their ability or inability or struggles to influence culture. So without that, it's a totally different scenario. So that is an absolute must. The second is what I call influence fluidity. And by definition, it is the flow of influence in a team that keeps the team aligned to strategy and accountable to each other. And we get that influence, that dynamic, that influence fluidity when we're developing all three areas of influence in the rapid influence formula.